The ancient Hebrews perceived that there were poetical portions in their sacred texts, as shown by their entitling as songs or chants passages such as Exodus chapter 15 verses 1 to 19 and Numbers chapter 21 verses 17 to 20. A song or chant is, according to the primary meaning of the term, poetry. The question as to whether the poetical passages of the Old Testament show signs of regular rhythm or meter is yet unsolved. Characteristics of ancient Hebrew poetry. Rhyme. It is often stated that ancient Hebrew poetry contains almost no rhyme. This assertion is understandable because the ancient texts preserved in the Hebrew Bible were written over a period of at least a millennium. Over that length of time, the pronunciation of every language changes. Words that were rhyming pairs at the beginning of that period may no longer rhyme at the end of that period. Further, different tribal groups or other groups of Hebrew speakers undoubtedly pronounced words differently in one and the same era. Using English as an example, we would be hard-pressed to find rhyme or even meter in the opening verses of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English, if we were to pronounce the words of that poem as we pronounce their direct descendants in modern English. Even within contemporary English, some speakers rhyme, again, with rain, while others rhyme, again, with pen. The phonological phenomena that obscure the rhymes of Chaucer only 600 years after his death are also to be found in biblical Hebrew texts which spanned a millennium. One fine example of rhyme and meter in ancient Hebrew texts is found in the book of Proverbs 6-9-10. As Hebraeus Seth Ben Mordecai points out, these two verses, split into 4 lines of poetry, demonstrate both internal rhyme and end-of-line rhyme, as well as noticeable meter. Thus, the last word of the first line rhymes with the last word of the last line. In the third line, the second and fourth words create an internal rhyme with each other. Finally, the first word of the second line is identical to the first word of the first line, linking those two lines even without obvious rhyme. Similar rhyming verses within the Hebrew Bible ought to put to rest the question. It is sometimes stated that ancient Hebrew texts demonstrate assonance more often than rhyme. Indeed, assonance is prominent in ancient Hebrew texts, as are other forms of sound matching. An example of assonance is found in the first song mentioned above, where assonance occurs at the ends of the lines, as in Anwehu and Erememahu. It is, of course, true that consonants of hu can occur frequently in the Hebrew, because the language allows speakers to affix object cases suffixes to verbs. What is notable when comparing ancient Hebrew poetry to contemporary English poetry is the playfulness of the authors, and their evident willingness to use multiple sound matching schemes, rather than limiting themselves to simple rhymes at the end of verses, as in English. Unusual forms. The employment of unusual forms of language cannot be considered as a sign of ancient Hebrew poetry. In the sentences of Noah, the form lamo occurs, but this form, which represents partly lahim and partly lo, has many counterparts in Hebrew grammar, as, for example, chemo instead of ke, or emo equals them, or emo equals there, or clemo equals to them, forms found in passages for which no claim to poetical expressions is made. Then there are found heeto equals beast, osri equals tying, and yeshuata equals salvation, 3 forms that probably retain remnants of the old endings of the nominative, genitive, and accusative. Again, in Lamech's words, Adar and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. The 2 words, Hazin and Imra, attract attention, because they occur for the first time in this passage, although there had been an earlier opportunity of using them. In Genesis chapter 3 verse 8 and 3:10, Hazin equals to hearken could have been used just as well as its synonym, Shama equals to hear. Furthermore, Imra equals speech might have been used instead of the essentially identical Daba in Genesis chapter 9 verse 1 and following. but its earliest uses, as stated above, in Genesis chapter 4 verse 23, in place of Adam equals man Enosh, is employed. A systematic review of similar unusual forms of Hebrew grammar and Hebrew words occurring in certain portions of the Old Testament. Such forms have been called dialectis poetica since the publication of Robert Loth's Relectionis de Sacra Poesie Hebraeorum, i.e. But this designation is ambiguous and can be accepted only in agreement with the rule a party potieri fit denomination for some of these unusual forms and words are found elsewhere than in the songs of the Old Testament. These unusual forms and expressions do not occur in all songs, and there are several psalms that have none of these peculiarities. Parallelism. Not even the Parallelismus Membrorum is an absolutely certain indication of ancient Hebrew poetry. This parallelism is a phenomenon noticed in the portions of the Old Testament that are at the same time marked frequently by the so-called dialectis poetica. It consists in a remarkable correspondence in the ideas expressed in two successive units. For example, the above-cited words of Lamech, Adar and Zillah, "Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech," in which are found Hazin and Imra, show a remarkable repetition of the same thought. But this ideal chorythmy is not always present in the songs of the Old Testament or in the Psalter, as the following passages will show. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. Saul and Jonathan, the beloved and the lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and fine linen, and he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. I laid me down and slept, I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people, that have set themselves against me round about. Julius Ley says therefore correctly that the poets did not consider themselves bound by parallelism to such an extent as not to set it aside when the thought required it, though this restriction must be made to James Robertson's view. It remains the case that the distinguishing feature of the Hebrew poetry is the rhythmical balancing of parts, or parallelism methought. Various rhetorical forms are found in the parallelisms of biblical poetry. These include synonymous parallelism. In this form, the second unit says much the same thing as the first one, with variations. An example is found in Amos chapter 5 verse 24. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. Another example of synonymous parallelism is found in Isaiah chapter 2 verse 4 or Micah chapter 4 verse 3. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Antithesis is also found. Here, the second unit directly contrasts with the first, often making the same point from the opposite perspective. From Proverbs chapter 10 verse 1. A wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. Emblematic parallelism occurs where one unit renders figuratively the literal meaning of another. Synthetic parallelism occurs where the units balance, clause for clause, with one unit building upon or adding to the first. From Psalm chapter 14 verse 2. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men, to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. Climactic parallelism occurs where the second unit partially balances the first, but also adds a summative thought or completes the series. From Psalm chapter 29 verse 1. Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty, give unto the Lord glory and strength. External parallelism occurs when the syntactic units balance one another across multiple verses. Here, some of the permitted sorts of parallelisms are added not only within a single line of verse, but also between lines. From Isaiah chapter 1 verses 27 to 28. Zion shall be redeemed with judgment, and her converts with righteousness. and the destruction of the transgressors and the sinners shall be together, and they that forsake the Lord shall be consumed. It should also be noted that external parallelism can also accumulate in a chiastic or ring structure that may include many verses. For example, Psalm chapter 1 utilizes synonymous, synthetic, and emblematic parallelism before turning antithetically back to emblematic, synthetic, and then synonymous parallels. Quantitative rhythm. The poetry of the ancient Hebrews is not distinguished from the other parts of the Old Testament by rhythm based on quantity, though in view of Greek and Roman poetry it was natural to seek such a rhythm in the songs and psalms of the Old Testament. William Jones, for example, attempted to prove that there was a definite sequence of long and short syllables in the ancient Hebrew poems, but he could support this thesis only by changing the punctuation in many ways, and by allowing great license to the Hebrew poets. However, on reading the portions of the Old Testament marked by the so-called dialectis poetica or by parallelism, no such sequence of long and short syllables can be discovered, and Sivers says, Hebrew prosody is not based on quantity as classical prosody is. Accentual rhythm. Many scholars hold that the Hebrew poet considered only the syllables receiving the main accent, and did not count the intervening ones. Examples contrary to this are not found in passages where forms of the so-called dialectis poetica are used. Aslay holds, and Israel Davidson has proved that the choice of lamo instead of lahim favors in only a few passages the opinion that the poet intended to cause an accented syllable to be followed by an unaccented one. The rhythm of Hebrew poetry may be similar to that of the German Nibelungenlied, a view that is strongly supported by the nature of the songs sung by the populace of Palestine in the early 20th century. These songs have been described by L. Schneller in the following words. The rhythms are manifold. There may be 8 accents in one line, and 3 syllables are often inserted between 2 accents. The symmetry and variation being determined by emotion and sentiment. Also in Palestine, Gustav Hermann Dahlmann observed, N lines with 2, 3, 4, and 5 accented syllables may be distinguished, between which 1 to 3, and even 4, unaccented syllables may be inserted, the poet being bound by no definite number in his poem. Occasionally 2 accented syllables are joined. Such free rhythms are, in Davidson's opinion, found also in the poetry of the Old Testament. Under the stress of their thoughts and feelings, the poets of Israel sought to achieve merely the material, not the formal symmetry of corresponding lines. This may be observed, for example, in the following lines of Psalm chapter 2. Serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. This is shown more in detail by Koenig, and Karl Heinrich Kornel has confirmed this view by saying, equal length of the several stichoi was not the basic formal law of Jeremiah's metric construction. Sivers is inclined to restrict Hebrew rhythm by various rules, as he attacks Karl Budd's view that a foot which is lacking in one half of a verse may find a substitute in the more ample thought of this shorter line. Furthermore, the verse of the Old Testament poetry is naturally iambic or anapestic, as the words are accented on one of the final syllables. The dirges. A special kind of rhythm may be observed in the dirges, called by the Hebrews kinot. A whole book of these elegies is contained in the Hebrew Bible, the first of them beginning thus. How does the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces? How is she become tributary? The rhythm of such lines lies in the fact that a longer line is always followed by a shorter one, as in the hexameter and pentameter of Greek poetry. This change was intended to symbolize the idea that a strenuous advance in life is followed by fatigue or reaction. This rhythm, which may be designated elegiac measure, occurs also in Amos chapter 5 verse 2, expressly designated as a kinnah. The sad import of his prophecies induced Jeremiah also to employ the rhythm of the dirges several times in his utterances. He refers here expressly to the Maconote, who in the East still chant the death song to the trembling tone of the pipe. In not, are found also in Ezekiel chapter 19 verse 1, 26-17, 27-2, 32-2 and following, 32-16, 32-19 and following. This elegiac measure, being naturally a well-known one, was used also elsewhere, as, for example, in Psalm chapter 19 verses 8-10. The rhythm of the kinnah has been analyzed especially by Buddha. Similar funeral songs of the modern Arabs are quoted by Wettstein, as, e.g., "Oh, if he only could be ransomed. Truly, I would pay the ransom." Anadiplosis. A special kind of rhythm was produced by the frequent employment of the so-called anadiplosis, a mode of speech in which the phrase at the end of one sentence is repeated at the beginning of the next, as, for instance, in the passages, "They came not to the help of the Lord," i.e., to protect God's people, "to the help of the Lord against the mighty," and, "From whence shall my help come? My help cometh from the Lord." Many similar passages occur in 15 of the Psalms, 120-134, which also contain an unusual number of epinalepsis, or catchwords, for which Israel Davidson proposed the name Litten. Thus, there is the repetition of Shechan in Psalm chapter 120 verse 5, 6 of Shalom in verses 6 and 7 of the same psalm, and the catchword Yishmor in Psalm chapter 121 verses 7, 8. As the employment of such repetitions is somewhat suggestive of the mounting of stairs, the superscription, Shahamalot, found at the beginning of these 15 psalms, may have a double meaning. It may indicate not only the purpose of these songs, to be sung on the pilgrimages to the festivals at Jerusalem, but also the peculiar construction of the songs, by which the reciter is led from one step of the inner life to the next. Such graduated rhythm may be observed elsewhere, for the peasants in modern Syria accompany their national dance by a song the verses of which are connected like the links of a chain, each verse beginning with the final words of the preceding one. Acrostics. Alphabetical acrostics are used as an external embellishment of a few poems. The letters of the alphabet, generally in their ordinary sequence, stand at the beginning of smaller or larger sections of Psalms 9-10, 15, 34, 37, 111,112, 119, 145, Proverbs chapter 31 verses 10-31, Lamentations chapters 1-4, and also of Sirach 51-13-29, as the newly discovered Hebrew text of this book has shown. Alphabetical and other acrostics occur frequently in Neo-Hebraic poetry. The existence of acrostics in Babylonian literature has been definitely proved, and alphabetical poems are found also among the Samaritans, Syrians, and Arabs. Cicero says that the verse of the Sibyl was in acrostics, and the so-called oracular Sibyllina contain an acrostic, a secondary phenomenon, which distinguishes a part of the poems of the Old Testament from the other parts. Is the so-called accentuatia poetica. It has been much slighted. Although not all the poetical portions of the Old Testament are marked by a special accentuation, the Book of Job in 3-3-42-6 and the books of Psalms and Proverbs throughout have received unusual accents. This point will be further discussed later on.